Hello everybody, welcome to the History Valley podcast with your host Jacob Berman. Today I'm joined once again by Dr. Robert M. Price. He's been on this channel a couple of times before. And today we're going to be talking about, we actually talked about his book before, The Amazing Colossal Apostle. I highly recommend it. I'll leave a link to it in the description and to his Amazon page. It's a really good book. And we're going to be getting into some Simon Magus, this as we did before in one of those episodes. We're going to be looking into parallels between Simon Magus and Paul. I'm going to be asking him questions about that. And we're going to be talking about the connection between Queen Helena, the possible connection between Queen Helena, and the Helen character that appears in Simon's story. So there's a lot of interesting, exciting things to get into with that. So that being said, Dr. Price, thank you for joining me again.
Oh, thanks for having me.
No problem. Could you tell us all about what you think is the best parallels that you can think of between the character of Simon Magus with Paul?
Well, the real granddaddy of the whole approach is something that the Tübingen scholars, F.C. Bauer and his disciples, pointed out in the Book of Acts, that the story in, chapter 8 or 9, I can never remember, where Philip the deacon goes to Samaria and sees that Simon the sorcerer, Simon the Magus or magician, is claiming to be God, the great power, and that he proves this by some kind of magic, which is, of course, always just a pejorative way of referring to the other guy's miracles. Like when the Pharisees say about Jesus, I don't listen to this guy, it's just trickery, he's in league with the devil. And or in the Quran, that Muhammad's critics say it is plain magic, and so it's very common the world over to do that. So, at any rate, he does some kind of miracles, and none of them are specified there, though they are in later works like the Acts of Peter and so on, which I'll get to in a minute. But he is superseded by Peter, who somehow convinces everybody, just apparently by the preached word, to convert to Christianity instead. And they're all baptized. And the way Acts portrays it, it was like everybody in Samaria was hooked on Simon, but then flipped right over to Jesus as Philip preached him. But since Luke has this authoritarian agenda that he wants Jerusalem and the 12 to be the home office and the Vatican basically for Christianity, he doesn't have Philip's converts receive the Holy Spirit, even though they've been baptized. And various scholars have been debating this for decades, like, well, what was wrong with the baptism, or mustn't they have received the Holy Spirit, but they didn't get the baptism of the Holy Spirit yet, infusion of power? It doesn't draw any distinctions like that, and it seems pretty clear that it's just an artificial distinction drawn. Well, yeah, Philip did get them on the bandwagon, but they needed that apostolic touch. And so when Peter is informed of this, he and his shadow, John, whom nothing really is said except that he came along for the ride, Peter goes up there and lays hands on them. I mean, they don't need to be preached to. They've already converted, but he lays hands on them and they receive the Holy Spirit, apparently with some kind of audible or visual fireworks, because Simon Magus, who himself is converted, supposedly, he sees this happening And he's a magician, and he sees what looks to him like a kind of a trick. And he says to Peter, I'll gladly pay you if you teach me how to do this. Well, what was it? Well, comparing it with other stories and Acts, probably speaking in tongues. It was something an outsider would have noticed, not just taken their word for it. Yeah, I guess I received the Holy Spirit. Now, there must have been something that he thought, whoa, this is pretty good. Well, Peter says to him, as J.B. Phillips translates it, to hell with you and your money. May it perish with you, etc. He says, you thought you could buy the gift of God with money? I can see what's in store for you, buddy. You're going to be bound in the, I think that's the fundamentalist thought police coming down the road. That you're going to be bound in chains of misery and so on. And he said, no, please pray for me that nothing like that will happen. And he says, you have neither part nor lot in this ministry. Well, Bauer and the others suddenly realized, wait a second, what is this? This guy is like a rival to Peter, and he is trying to purchase the prerogative of apostles. It's uniquely theirs to impart the Spirit with signs following. And he wants to buy it, but they repudiate it. And that's it. We don't hear any more of what happened with him there. Well, that looks kind of, is there an echo in this place? And they said, this is kind of like in Galatians, where Paul says that he had his own independent ministry and he was converting the Gentiles left and right, but some trouble arose and he went to Jerusalem to see the pillars, the head honchos. He doesn't say the 12, interestingly, but the 3 pillars: Cephas, who presumably is supposed to be Peter, and James and John, presumably the sons of Zebedee. And he says he in private presented the basics of his gospel message to them, because he wanted recognition from them. It's not clear why exactly, he doesn't say, but there would have been a problem if he's flying the Christian flag and they're saying, hey, this guy's not correct, don't listen to him. So he didn't want that trouble, and he said, we're all on the same page, aren't we? And he says that there was debate, but they agreed. They said, yeah, okay, you do have a bit of a different message, but as you're preaching to Gentiles, we're not. We're, as Jesus says in a Q saying, we're judging the tribes of Israel. We're the part of the 12, the patriarchs and all of that. You go your way among the Gentiles, and you're right, they're not Jews. They don't need to become Jews and keep all the laws. That's a needless stumbling block. For us, it's nothing. We were raised that way. It's second nature. But all right, you go your way. Don't tell Jews not to keep the law, but Gentiles, that's all right. And he said the only requirement they laid upon him was to collect money from his Gentile communities to send back to them. Now, why would they need it? Well, according to Acts anyway, they had established a kind of a socialist commune where they pooled all their money and resources. Well, naturally, as Margaret Thatcher said, not Margaret Barker now, but Margaret Thatcher, that socialism fails because sooner or later you run out of other people's money. Well, if that was true, it's easy to see why they needed some infusions of cash from this wider public. After all, Christianity started with us. You're lucky to get in on it, so you owe it to us. And Paul said, I was only too happy to do that. Basically, I think what you're dealing with is tribute money. We are we're the kings of Christianity here. So you bring us tribute from the nations, and we're okay. And he did, but in Paul's letters, there are indications that after he had collected this money, and he mentions that several places that he was doing it. Come on, hand it over, cough it up for the poor in Jerusalem. Once he got there, he didn't get much of a welcome. And this is very thinly veiled in Acts itself as of chapter 20. He gets back there and James forewarns him, who is now James, apparently James the Just. He's taken over and he says, well, Paul, it's great the success you've had, but I got to warn you, though we've had success, all of our people are zealots for the Torah. And I'm afraid they've heard that you go around preaching to diaspora Jews that they don't need to keep the Torah, and they're pretty mad about it. Now, I know this must be a distortion. I know it can't be true. And you almost get the feeling he's just saying, let's put a good face on this. Tell you what, you can demonstrate your fidelity to the Torah by taking this money you've brought and paying for the sacrifices of some of our brethren who are now coming to the end of their Nazirite vows and have to offer sacrifices. That'll show them. Everybody will see that and say, oh, he is a fellow doer of the law. But it doesn't work out that way, because though he does use the money for that, one of his companions, Titus, not a Jew, they get the impression that Paul is bringing him into the temple. And of course, you couldn't do that if you weren't a Jew. You could come into the court of the Gentiles, but you're in the second class seats. And there was this plaque that we actually have. They've discovered it, where it says Gentiles come no further under pain of death. So they had a lot of interested Gentiles, God-fearers, but they couldn't actually enter the temple proper. Well, somebody started the rumor that that's what happened, and Paul brought him in, though he says he didn't. And so this creates a riot. And Luke seems to want you to think that these are evil, non-Christian Jews, but if you connect it up with what he has James saying just before, it has to be that they're Christian zealots for the Torah who want to lynch Paul. And he narrowly escapes. He gives him his speech. Here's how I came to this. Jesus told me this, and they got even madder. So it didn't work out. Well, in Romans, he says, I've collected the money. I'm headed for Jerusalem. Pray with me that they'll find it acceptable. Had he heard rumors that they might not? Probably so. Somebody would have said something like James does in Acts. So watch out. As Tony Soprano says, you could be walking into a buzzsaw. So he risks it, but they don't accept the money. And that would mean that they've welched on the deal. It seems not viable anymore, and they start sending their emissaries around to these congregations on the heels of Paul and saying, well, it's kind of like the Peter and Philip thing. Yeah, it's good you've come this far, but you haven't come far enough. You really need to be circumcised like Jesus was. And Paul gets really mad at that and says, they stabbed me in the back. I went to Jerusalem. We all made nice. And now look what they're doing. They're false apostles. Peter himself, what a hypocrite, and so on and so on. Well, where does Helena come into this? Well, this much was enough to make Bauer think again about something in the pseudo-Clementine literature, these two related pious novels, the Recognitions and the Homilies, both ascribed to Clement, who's mentioned in the New Testament and letters briefly. It's really a fascinating religious novel, and it incorporates a second century work scholars refer to as an Ebionite Acts of the Apostles. And in this, Peter has a face down with Simon Magus in Rome. Now, I personally think, and I get into this a bit in my book that's at the publisher now called The Gospels Behind the Gospels, I personally think that Luke was working with a story in which Philip has substituted for Peter, And it was Peter who overcame Simon Magus in a miracle contest, which is what happens in the Acts of Peter. I think implicitly there must have been something like that Luke was using but wanted to tone down. And let's see, in this Ebionite Acts, Peter is debating with Simon Magus, and it's very interesting that Simon is said to be preaching salvation by grace. You don't need to keep the Torah. It was imposed by angels who created the world and so on. And he has this consort, Helena. Well, I'll get to her in a second. He doesn't believe in the prophets in the Old Testament. Who does this remind us of? And Bauer said, well, this has to be Paul. He's just going under this guise of Simon Magus, the anti-Simon Peter, a miracle worker, a mere charlatan. And Peter outdid him with genuine miracles, which is just what happens in the Acts of John. One after the other, Peter always wins, and Simon rigs up some Deus ex machina contraption where he seems to fly above the Colosseum, but then Peter prays, let him crash, and he does, and he's hopelessly crippled and so forth. Boy, what a Christian attitude. Bauer said it's very clear that and the authority. Where did Simon, or Peter, claim to get his authority? He said, well, I had a vision of Jesus. He told me all this stuff. And Peter says, that's impossible. You're just hallucinating, pal. We were with Jesus. We know what he said. You're just dreaming. And it's interesting back and forth because Simon says, now, you know how easy it is to misunderstand the speech of a teacher. But when you have a vision like this, intuitively, there is certainty and clarity. So I'm afraid I'm in a better position than you are to know the true doctrine of Christ. And of course, they don't get along. And if this is so Pauline, again, Bauer said, in both places, Simon Magus must be an alien for Simon Peter. And it's just both are trying to mask this by dividing Paul from Simon Magus, because by this time, Jewish and Hellenistic Christianity were reconciled. And they had all these stories about Paul, but Jewish Christians thought he was the Antichrist. Well, they couldn't let that stand, so they split the character in two. Oh, yeah, there's the good old Apostle Paul. And if you want to know what he really thought, read the Pastoral Epistles. That's an Orthodox Catholic Paul. But all that stuff about no Torah, the angels, and so forth, no, that was this nut who was a visionary but a false prophet. That was Simon Magus, a mere trickster. And so you have the rehabilitated Paul and the evil counterpart as Mr. Hyde alter ego, Simon Magus. And therefore it's interesting that in early church literature, the church fathers and heresiologists like Irenaeus and Hippolytus and all these guys said that, Tertullian said that of Marcion, who's connected with Simon Magus, that's another story, that he's the apostle. He says that Paul is the apostle of Marcion and the apostle of the heretics. Of course, he's arguing that Paul was really a good Catholic, but he's the one that the Marcionites and Gnostics claim. They lay claim to him. Oh yeah, he taught us everything we know. Whereas the Catholics said Simon was the fountainhead of all heresies. But Gnostics said, you can call them heresies if you want, but it was Paul who taught us this. Well, they're both right because they were the same guy, though this is no longer realized by the time the apologists get to work. Now, one more thing I'll shut up about this. Where does Helena come in? Well, there was a Queen Helen or Helena of Adiabene, which was in or adjacent to Edessa, which not long after this converted officially to Christianity. But first, these pagans converted to Judaism. This one Jewish traveler who was kind of like Paul, a tent maker or something, but preaching his religion. He convinces, I think it's Prince Isaetes, Helena's son, to convert to Judaism as she had. But maybe you don't want to get circumcised because the Edessans, they're not going to take to that. They think that's mutilation, as a lot of Romans did. I would stop short of that. And he said, well, all right. But then later, another Jewish wandering teacher came up and said, I hear you've embraced the true faith, but you've not been circumcised. And he said, well, yeah, and he explains why. And he says, take a look at Genesis, what was it, 17 or something, where God makes the covenant with Abraham. What does he say? You got to get circumcised, you and your whole household, and so forth. What do you make of that? Why not get circumcised? All right, you're right, I will. And so he gets away with it. People, the subjects still like him. Well, they were apparently members of some kind of sectarian baptismal group. That they weren't like Pharisaic Jews, but more or less conservative Jews. It mattered to them what happened at home in Jerusalem, at the home office. And when the famine happened under Claudius Caesar, a lot of people were going hungry. And Queen Helena said, well, I've got a lot of resources. I'm going to send them a whole bunch of money to buy grain. And she sent emissaries with it. Well, interestingly, in Acts chapter 11, I think, Paul and Barnabas, I think, are sent to bring money to Jerusalem for famine relief. Now, that also sort of sounds like Paul's collection being delivered. It may have been another version of it, but it makes you wonder if he was not possibly the first of those Jewish travelers who said you can be converted without circumcision. And the guy that came after him, is he one of the people that dogged Paul's heels? Says, no, you got to finish the job. And that's interesting because one last thing, as Eisenman points out, there were several cities called Antioch, and the scene in Antioch in Galatians where Paul and Cephas have this showdown, that might have been not Syrian Antioch, but Edessan Antioch. We just assume it was, Acts even mentions another one, right? Antioch of Pisidia, and that's not all of them. And so I kind of find a lot of that quite attractive, and it seems to me that if Paul is associated with Helena, and Simon is associated with Helen of Tyre, of course it's speculative, but it makes a lot of sense to me if it's two versions of the same thing. Sorry about that.
Oh, no problem. And that's really where my research on Adiabene largely began. And I made sure to get the Chronicle of Michael the Great, the Chronicle of Suknan. I got all those books, and I went through them, and I came to the conclusion, and this did make a particular, like there was somebody else, another author out there, who saw my research and wasn't too happy about it, because I leaned towards Eisman's interpretation of Adiabene. I'm like, wait a minute. These guys are preaching anti-circumcision. There's a story related to that, and that Procopius is writing really, really late, hundreds of years later, but he has a story about the king of Edessa, about Ogarus. And I've talked about him many times on my channel. And Ogarus, he was a friend of Emperor Augustus, and he stayed in the house of Augustus for like a decade. And I'm like, that's really strange, because there are some people out there that they have a theory that's and it's kind of an alternative history theory that the Adiabene were the leaders of the Jewish revolt, And I look at their supposed evidence of this, the people that the adherents of that theory, and I'm like, I just don't see it. Like how could they be the leaders of the revolt and allow anti-Torah Jews to stick around?
Hmm.
I'm sure that would anger some messianic rebels. And
Hmm.
not only that, but Josephus tells us this story in the preface to Jewish Wars that the Jews begged their brethren beyond the Euphrates, and Josephus went as far as being specific that he's talking about the Adiabene, and they refused to join.
Hmm.
And all that's adding up to me, at the very least, they want nothing to do with the war against Rome.
Hmm.
If not, pro-Roman. And in the Chronicle of Zutnan, they have this guy called King Manu IV, and he ruled Edessa in the early 1st century CE. And it makes King Abgar V his brother. It says, okay, Manu bar Manu, Abgar bar Manu, and they're both sons of King Manu III. So when I put all that together, I'm like, King Manu IV looks like Monobazus, Senior, Monobazus, in Josephus.
Hmm.
I think that's an educated guess that that's him. And in Tacitus, he mentions Akbarus,
Hmm.
and he was an ally of Izates. He helped defend the border to Parthia, because they were having some troubles with Parthia around 50-ish AD, CE. And I put all that together like, okay, that's strange, because Tacitus says Akbarus was the king of the Arabs. To me, he's distinguishing Abgar, and Tacitus is the earliest guy we have on this Abgar guy. He's distinguishing him from the Adiabene, which is interesting, because he wouldn't have called him the king of the Arabs if he were related to the king of Adiabene, in my opinion.
Hmm.
He's distinguishing the two as two separate royals. And then the first time we start seeing Abgar and Edessa culminate together, conglomerate into the same family, is coming out of Eusebius. As far as I'm aware of, he's the earliest source on this. He writes this text, the Doctrine of Adi, and it makes a lot of mistakes. Like Albinus is, even the translator said Albinus is a governor Albinus in Josephus, and he's writing letters to Tiberius 25 years after he's dead, which is fun, which made me laugh a little bit there, and it wasn't hard for me to guess why the forger made that mistake, because we have a Jesus appearing before Albinus and Josephus, Jesus ben Ananus.
Hmm.
And it seems that the Doctrine of Adi is trying to treat the gospel Christ and this eschatological Jesus in the 60s as if they were the same character. That's at least my interpretation. That does explain the errors, in my opinion, in the Doctrine of Adi.
Fascinating.
But yeah, the fact that the Clementine recognition was very late, not as late as that text is though, I don't think. It says that Paul was involved in the murder of James, as we all know, and Eisman points this out. You talk about it in your books. You talk about Eisman, who talks about it. And to me, I interpreted that, and I told you about this before in a previous discussion, that it looks like, I think it's confusing Paul with Ananus and Josephus, because I feel like he's taking over the role of that character, murdering James. And in the same way in Acts, Stephen replaces James like Hollywood actors switching roles in a movie.
Mm-hmm.
And Paul is involved in his death in some ways, like I approved of his killing. That's what Acts has him saying, puts that in his mouth. I feel like there are two different ways of reorienting the story to Paul. And of course, in Acts, we all know his teacher is called Ananias.
Yeah.
Which does seem to be the same person as that guy in Josephus that murdered James, I think.
That would make sense, though. It's such a common name. It's
right.
Tempting, but it's
right.
unresolvable. But all we can do is speculate and see what sense a particular reading would make of other puzzling things. Which, if it can, that gives it more credit. So,
yeah.
And it does.
If it is correct, it does explain the confusion in the later literature.
Mm.
That's all. That's it's just yeah, I know an explanation that explains what data doesn't mean it's correct, but it just means it has some sort of evidence for it.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
would
it's a
say.
strong reading, as some critics say, and you may never be able to get further than that, but that's worth doing,
Right.
considering possibilities.
Um, and there's this other thing, and you talk about the amazing colossal apostle. I'm kind of shifting the discussion a little bit here. You talk about Apelles, and I thought that was really fascinating. You identify the Apelles in the Apelles of the Gnostic, but the Apelles in the letter to the Romans.
Hmm.
Could you explain that identification to the audience? Because that's fascinating to me.
Well, these names, it's very much like the Old Testament genealogies. Why are they there? Well, I mean, we skip over them. They're just boring to us. It could just be a bunch of, like in The Shining, with when uh, Jack Torrance's wife sees his manuscript, all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy, and it's just a whole bunch of pages of that. And it might as well be that when we were so and so begat so and so, but it was hot stuff to them because these things were credentials, whether they had any truth to them or not. They were trying to say, "Oh yeah, I've got the pedigree here. I'm a priest, and I got all the requirements fulfilled." And so what if we're replacing the Levitical priesthood? Well, it's all right. I mean, that's the whole reason of the Melchizedek thing in Hebrews. Who's got the priestly credentials? Well, it depends on what you mean by that. And I think that's the same way with um, the things in the epistles, like even in First Corinthians, where he says, give due honor to the household of Stephanus and so on. What does that mean? I mean, on the surface, of course, it means Paul knows these leaders who host meetings in their homes, and he says, be sure to thank them for it. But I can't help thinking that there is a kind of a hereditary thing. Like in eastern North Carolina here, we have a bunch of churches named for the people that started them, like Henderson's Church of God. I mean, I always thought that was kind of cheeky to do. I mean, to stick your own moniker on the thing. I mean, how about Holy Ghost Tabernacle rather than Smith's Tabernacle? It's like a hot dog stand or something. Well, I wondered if that's not what was going on there, that certain people claim descent from an apostolic colleague of Paul, and that's why that guy's name is mentioned. It's not really about him. He's dead and gone, but it's about people known to be descended from him. And in Romans 16, there's all of these names with notes about very few of them, though they're pretty interesting. The ones that are, like Andronicus and Junia, noteworthy among the apostles. What? Junia is almost certainly intended as a female name. And feminists are right to draw attention to this. Wait a second, that's telling us something important about the role of women in the early church. Or so-and-so who was in Christ before me. In a book, I can't think of it now, Constructing Paul or something like that, this one sociologist says, is Paul saying he comes from a family of Christian workers? That seems to clash with this whole idea that he was thug working for the Sanhedrin and was persecuting Christians. What? So sometimes they're really interesting traditions stated or implied, or like Eisenman says, the Herodian names in there. Herod, Antipas, and so forth. What, you mean the Herod, the Antipas? I don't know, but with those names, it implies some kind of connection, and so there's perhaps a polemical element in these things. Julius Africanus says that the heirs of Jesus would go around showing genealogies. Why? They just sign up with Ancestry.com or something. They were either claiming to be descendants of the family of Jesus, or they were claiming priestly credentials, and Julius Africanus didn't understand it. But that continued on, and surely that's why we have the two genealogies of Jesus himself. Well, I think Romans 16 is another one of those, and it means to associate Paul with certain families and individuals of interest to the writer of Romans, or of Romans 16, which may have been an independent document at first. So there is interesting stuff in there. We don't quite know what to make of it yet, but Eisenman's got a pretty sharp eagle eye on the possibilities.
Yeah, I tend to lean towards Eisenman's identification, that it's, if we take it by face value, it seems to link Paul directly to the line of the Herods. He's related to them in some way. At least I think that's what I think.
Yeah, that's quite plausible, even probable.
Yeah, yeah, I'd say so. And that would nicely tuck itself in with his involvement with the death of James, if the Ananias identifications are correct. It goes together very nicely. At least I think.
Fascinating.
And everything is kind of going back to the Adiabene. There's this king that Josephus mentions, and we're going like way back earlier in events to 4 BCE, King Zamaris, who came from beyond the Euphrates, the king of the Babylonian Jews, no doubt describing the same people, I think. That's got to be connected to the Adiabene. They're in the same area. And he's going to Israel because of some sort of troubles with the border. He couldn't hold his kingdom. So he fled with 500 cavalry to Israel, and he was given land and tax exemption by Herod the Great. And he had a son named Jason, and that son had a son named Philip. And Jason was a bodyguard of Herod Agrippa I, and Philip was a general, some kind of general, during the time of Herod Agrippa II and during the Jewish War, leaning towards Rome's side.
Wow.
Yeah. I think, like, at some point down the line, I would like to do like another discussion with you just on that. Like, there's a lot to go on there. But for now, what that tells me, all the evidence that's showing me, is that these people seem to be at least in friendly terms with Rome. So they're friendly with the Herods, they're friendly with Rome. So that's why I'm having a hard time believing that these guys were involved, working with the Jewish rebels, because all of this seems to lean towards, okay, Roman friendliness is all I'm saying.
Well, Hugh Schoenfield, and I'm sure others, but I happen to remember, in his book, The Jew of Tarsus, and I think somewhere in the Passover plot, he suggests that Paul's Jewish Christian opponents were militant zealots who really were trying to impose another king, Jesus, and at least as a dynastic figurehead, and were trying to turn the world upside down. That's a little, I mean, we tend to think of that as part of jingoistic missionary lingo. I used to go to a conservative Baptist church decades ago, and we'd have these annual missionary conferences, and it was like, you know, you're getting ready for the children's crusade or something. And they would say, you know, we're conquering the world for Christ, and so on. Of course, people used to actually try to do that with guns and swords. They don't mean it that way. They just mean we're going to get out there and convert those heathen. And I wonder if we subtly read that into stuff like, you know, these men who have turned the world upside down have now come here, and that makes me think of the thousands of Jews who were all of them zealots for the Torah in Acts 20, apparently under the leadership of James. So there may have been these two very, I mean, we know there were at least two different big factions on the issue of are you a real Jew? Mustn't you become a real Jew to be a Christian? And such people would be much more likely to be against Rome than the Hellenistic Christians who say, oh, it's a big deal. I mean, we're not, who cares who's actually in charge over there? I always think it's, oh, yes, the Gentiles embrace Jesus as a Messiah. What do you mean? Imagine some Greek or Phoenician or Phrygian guy saying, how did you hear? The new king of Liechtenstein has been crowned. Oh, what the hell would they care? They've probably never even heard of this place. Big deal. So that's why they had to preach the Son of God and mythical entities and so on.
Yep, I agree, and that's exactly what I think about the Adiabene. There's too much Hellenism going on down there, way too much anti-Torah activity, for someone to feel secure that these guys were the leaders of the Jewish revolt. Josephus was quite plain as day that he blames the four philosophy of Sicarii, Judas the Galileans, sons practically. I mean, Menahem started he was the one that seized the army at Masada. I mean, not the Adiabene. Yeah. It's based on, this theory is based on this passage in Josephus, and Eisenman talks about this a bit. Monobasis and Cynodius from Adiabene. At best, you can interpret them as rogues from their kingdom that joined the rebels. After the war is already in progress at the battle against Cestius around 66 AD, and Josephus says that they were among the valiant that died in battle. Kind of strange he's calling them valiant. It's almost like he's being a little positive about his reports on their deaths, which he doesn't typically do that with rebels. I personally find that slightly suspicious. I'm not sure. I'm not totally sure what that means. It could mean they could have been there for different reasons, other than the reasons that appear from the vague passage. But that, at best, they were rogues. And there's no way that from that we can claim, anybody can claim it. I don't think anybody can lay a foundation to a claim that they were the leaders of the Jewish revolt. This doesn't make any sense to me from that. And the king isn't even involved. He said the kinsman of the king. Yeah, I mean, that's if everything is when Jerusalem fell on 70. What did Emperor Vespasian do? He gave not just his security. I find it interesting that Josephus says personal security to Monobasis II. The family of Monobasis II and Monobasis himself. Monobasis II. I'm like, okay, that's making sure they're going to be safe. That's what that sounds like to me. And Vespasian, he was quite wrathful towards the rebel leaders. He pretty much had them killed, including Simon Bargora, who was spared only to be humiliated in Rome, then killed. But that's not what happened to the Adiabene, is it? No, it's not. Just something I want to throw out there.
When you're writing all this up into a book.
I am. I am. I'm still working on it, and I will send it to you.
Oh, great.
I am. Yeah, and that's why I'm convinced, and I had a couple scholars on my channel before that agree with my interpretation that the Adiabene, they seem to be pro-Roman. I think that's the best explanatory power of the evidence I can think of. Or at the very least,
they sure wouldn't have gotten security from Rome if they didn't need it from irate fellow Jews for being on the wrong side.
And what's interesting is it's a Toldef Yeshu, very, very late text. I don't even use it as primary evidence, but there's something interesting it says. Herod, there's some guy called Herod, and this is ridiculous. Herod killed Nunbasis, the son of Helena, and Janias. I'm like, okay, now that's unless Arnold Schwarzenegger is doing tons of time traveling there. There's no way all of that's true simultaneously. Okay, Well, let's take some cleanup there. Let's take some a little bit of interpretation to fix that. What that tells me is a Jew killed Nunbasis. But I doubt it was Herod the Great, because Herod died in 4 BCE. He's not going to be alive on, according to Chronicles, Utenan Monobaz II, it calls him King Manu VI. He died in 71 AD. Doesn't tell us how he died, he just died. But there is a text that appears to have been written around the same time, or just a couple years after he died. Mar Bar Serapon's epistle to his son.
Uh-huh.
And he says something quite strange. The Jews killed their king. And it can't be talking about the Herods, because a Herod king didn't die at that time. And the only interpretation I'm left with is that he was talking about Monobasis.
Huh.
Because there's some people that claim that he's talking about Jesus, but I don't buy that. Especially because it seems to read like a recent event practically adjacent to the destruction of the temple.
Huh.
Or very close to it, or closely after it. And he was saying that the Jews were exiled from their land, which makes me think he's got to be writing after Masada fell, which fell basically 73 AD. I think some people argue 74, but I think it's 73. Anyway, I think he was talking about Monobasis. If that interpretation is correct, that explains the Told of Yeshu, and that means the Jews killed him.
Wow.
And I think anybody that thinks that this guy was a rebel should ask themselves a question: why would the Jews kill this guy? if he was in it with them, makes no sense to me.
Yeah.
Makes no sense to me at all.
Yeah, they probably would like to have given the same treatment to Josephus if they could have gotten to him.
I agree with that. That's why Josephus pretty much stays in Rome after the war is over to write his books.
I always wonder if Josephus understood himself not as a turncoat, but as somebody like Jeremiah, who said, look, I can see what's happening here. God could turn back the pagans, but he's obviously not doing it. It must be our fault. Why resist his guiding of history? I almost think he would have to have rationalized it that way, but that doesn't mean it's any less a theory that he would have embraced. Who knows? But I know he's doing something different. He's saying it's a bunch of troublemakers that got us into this. But I can well imagine him saying, I'm not assuming God's on our side. I want to be on his, and I'm afraid that's not ours anymore. But
yeah, and the thing is, Josephus does tell us in his autobiography, his life, that there's a particular Jesus that wanted to kill him, Jesus son of Saphius, and ironically, he's warned by another guy called Jesus about it, and he gets away. The Jesus son of Gamala warns Matthew, the father of Josephus, who warns Josephus that, hey, this dude told me this other guy is coming after you, man. You gotta get out of Dodge. And he does just that. And that pretty much goes to show, okay, Jesus, son of Gamala, is on Josephus' side. And on 68 AD, that same Jesus was at Jerusalem during the Zealot Civil War. And between the Edomites, probably Edomites, and the Jews. And just Jesus, along with the same guy, Ananias, that murdered James earlier, 6 years earlier, tries to convince the Jews, hey, you guys got to surrender, man. This has got to stop. The war's not going to work. And they just kill both of them right there on the spot.
Yeah, that you'd expect that, really.
Yeah. My God, that was a real good idea. You need to go right there into the city and tell them.
Yeah, boy.
What do you expect?
Now, you mentioned Schwarzenegger going back in time to mix up with these events. Did you ever see the Mad TV skit, Terminator 4 or whatever it was, where they have this guy doing a great, I don't know how they made him up to look so much like Schwarzenegger, but he goes back in time to prevent the crucifixion of Jesus.
I just see it.
It's on YouTube, and he gets the clothing from the wise men, and he's following Jesus around. He's got a machine gun, and at the Last Supper, and one of you will betray me, and he whips out the gun and fills Judas full of lead, and Jesus says, "What are you doing?" Judas was planning to kill you. Yeah, look. That's not how we do things. As part of the divine plan. And so Jesus promptly raises Judas from the dead.
Yep.
And the Terminator whips
Kills him
out the
again.
gun again. And he says, "Look, stop killing Judas." And he raises him again. And then we skip to the Via Dolorosa, where Jesus goes by carrying the cross. And this woman is bursting into tears. And the Terminator standing by and said, "Don't worry, he'll be back." Side splitting. Oh, so great.
I was thinking something like that with the Doctor of Adi. He came back as that Jesus in the 60s. That's kind of what it's leaning towards anyway. Yeah, but yeah, I am very, very confident based on the evidence that the Adiabene were heavily pro-Roman, heavily Hellenistic, heavily anti-Torah. I mean, even the Bereshit Rabbah has this. It talks about the circumcision thing, so Azatis and Monobazes read the book of Genesis. And to their dismay, they see the Abraham story, and they know that they better circumcise. So they'll whip out that knife where they use, and they just get it done. And I'm not sure if this is in the same text. I think it is. But there is a text that says that the Jews criticized Monobazes. And they said, "You're squandering our money." And he responds saying, "But my treasures are divine. They're in heaven, where none can reach." I'm like, oh, that sounds like the Gospel of Matthew.
Yeah, and like the Acts of Thomas.
Yeah.
King Gundeforus has given Tom all this money to build this palace, and he's giving it to the poor. And the king says, "Well, let me see it. Let me see what you've done." And he goes somewhere where there's a bunch of poor but no buildings. And he says, "Well, I figured you'd want a temple that will really last. The charity given in your name means that you have treasure in heaven in your own temple." I don't know how he got away with that one, but that's the same sort of thing. Speaking of the whole thing with take a second look at Genesis, and you'll see Abraham, the covenant, and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Eisenman says that that's the origin of the Acts story of the Ethiopian eunuch. That he is the emissary of Queen Candace, though there weren't any queens at the time, so it can't be historical. But Philip again goes down, and this guy is an African, and he's coming home from the Jerusalem temple for the holy day, though of course as he's a eunuch, so he can't have gone into the temple. But he's reading the scripture, and it's Isaiah 53, and here comes Philip jogging beside the chariot, and he says, "Hey, do you understand what you're reading?" And he says, "I have no idea. I need somebody to coach me here." "Oh, well, I don't mind if I do." And it's Jesus, and he gets baptized on the spot. I mean, it sounds an awful lot like this. Here is a guy who is sort of a convert, but hasn't gone the whole way. But lucky for him, here comes a traveling apostle or evangelist. And the queen thing, there wasn't a Queen Candace or Candace, but there was a Queen Helen, and is that who we're talking about here? But that Eisenman, what an amazing mind.
He really is. I have his book, Shames of Brother Jesus in the New Testament Code, and I love reading them. Those great books.
Yeah, I don't care how many thousands of pages these books are. They're just filled with interesting observations.
They are. They really are. Yeah, and the thing is, that raises a question, which you're bringing up with the Candac, the queen. Could she be possibly a dislocation of the Helen story?
Oh yeah,
If
that's what I mean. Yeah.
Oh, that is what you mean. That's what.
Yeah,
Okay,
that's where he
that makes
got it
sense.
from those
Yeah,
events or the Josephus account, and has he's used part of it where Helena sends the money. Well, somebody sends the money by Paul for the famine relief, and he split it up, and this is like the preceding thing where it's like the Ethiopian eunuch is Isaetes and so forth. It makes so much sense to me.
what do you think about his links between the Paul character and Saul, the kinsman of Agrippa, mentioned a few times by Josephus?
Could be. Though Hermann Dettering says he implies it's just the similarity of the name Saul to Paul and the Benjaminite connection, that this is another Catholicizing attempt by the author of Acts to root Paul and Pauline Christianity in the Old Testament, whereas in fact it was more like Marcionism, no Old Testament. But if Paul was actually Saul, well, that ain't bad. But I don't know. I mean, what Eisman says would make sense too, as would Stephen.
Yeah,
What he says about him, and Stephen being the replacement for James as a martyr, and
yeah,
Matthias as a replacement for James in the choosing of the successor to Judas. I don't know, but it just makes so much sense.
it does. And quite frankly, the Paul being the Saul guy doesn't contradict anything about him being son of Magus either.
Yeah, yeah.
It could all be true simultaneously.
Mhm.
There's no reason to think that they can't all go together like that. Um, Now I remember you saying, I don't remember if it was in the video. I think it was in the video. Yeah. Do you Am I correct in thinking that in remembering that you think that Paul was always he was always a Christian in a sense. He was always he was you don't buy that he switched sides.
I think it's likely that he didn't. I think it's parallel to Constantine, whom everybody says converted to Christianity, but in one fairly recent book I read about Constantine, it suggested no, he was raised a Christian. That there are, these two different
That
versions
makes sense.
with two versions each of the vision at the Milvian Bridge, and in two of them, it's just explaining where they got the design, the Kairos sign for the battle standard. But in the other two, he becomes a Christian. But this author, again, I forget the details now, says no, he was raised a Christian,
Hmm.
and that makes sense to me. As does this thing with Paul, especially if in light of two things, the reference in Romans 6 to him having um, uh, relatives who were already Christian workers before him. What is that? And then the other thing is that I think the story of his persecuting Christians is a literary creation plainly based on the sort of hypnotic conversion of Pentheus in the Bacchae of Euripides, and because the whole sequence in Act 16 is just right out of Euripides, and also in Second Maccabees 3 with Heliodorus, who is sent to the temple to appropriate the funds, and angels knock him off his horse and blind him, but pious Jews pray for him. He's healed and converts to Judaism and so forth. It's so similar, and both were well known. Like Luke, whoever he was, must have known these texts. So if that's, and there's as J.C. O'Neill showed, every one of the references to him being a persecutor of Christians in the epistles, there are good grounds for thinking these things are interpolations. And I would say, and I kind of see this in terms of Loisier's theory about the denials of Peter. He said this has to be. I mean, this shows Peter committing apostasy, denying Jesus. I mean, this is told by somebody that thinks Peter is damned. Well, it must have been Pauline Christians, and I extend that to say, well, I think that's the idea of Paul persecuting Christians too. That was made up by Torah Christians, and it's easy to see how, because Paul, as a Christian evangelist, was opposing the Christianity that required Torah observance of Gentiles. Well, there were Jews for decades, Ebionites and so forth, that saw Paul as like the Antichrist because of that. Now, he was fighting against the truth, and I could see it being easily possible that in the next generation, people didn't understand that and thought it meant, well, the true Christians are the ones that embrace the Torah. He was fighting against the Christians. I guess it was just Christians per se. He must have been a non-Christian, period. And so I think you wound up with two different polemical slanders, and it was part of the eventual reconciliation of the factions to swallow hard and say, well, we'll accept that Peter denied Jesus if you'll accept that Paul persecuted Christians, and what the heck, everybody has a bad day once in a while. I think that was so much makes sense on the Bauer hypothesis of the reconciliation of the two factions.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Yeah.
Oh, by the way, I have a real new thing, as far as I know, about Peter and Simon Magus coming out in my The Gospels Behind the Gospels. It suddenly hit me one day. If the Philip versus Simon and then Peter versus Simon sequence must originally have featured Peter in a miracle contest, because nothing else would have sufficed to put Simon out of the running, then there must have been miracles described in the original story. And I thought, maybe the author of Acts had material of this nature, and we still have it, because there are the two miracle chains in Acts. Both Paul and Peter raise somebody from the dead, both raise a lame guy, both have miraculous prison escapes, both square off with a sorcerer, both heal in superstitiously crazy ways with a shadow or with his handkerchiefs and all that. It made me wonder, wait a second, have these simply been redistributed, and this was originally part of Luke's source that had, anything you can do, I can do better? I've never heard that suggested, and it may just because I'm insane, but I propose this in that book. I'd be interested to hear if anybody does anything but call the loony bin to pick me up.
I would never say that about you.
Oh, boy. In fact, the epigram or epigraph or whatever to the book is a quote, if I could discover any one of those things, I wouldn't care if they did say I was crazy. Dr. Henry Frankenstein, from the first Frankenstein movie. I thought, yeah, that's the way I feel. If I could make a big discovery, even if they said this guy's nuts, that's okay by me.
So that being said, do you? I know that in one of our previous discussions, you talked about that Paul. You think that Galatians 3-6 was probably written by Marcion. Then we get Acts, and then we get two more chapters in Galatians that were put in the beginning, Galatians 1 and 2. Mm-hmm. From that, I take it you think that do you think the Simon Magus material in Acts potentially goes back to earlier material that mentions Simon Magus that predates all the material we got on Paul?
What predates it? Tell me again.
Simon Magus material.
Yeah, I think so, in all probability. And because Dettering argued that Simon was his actual name, and that
Hmm.
Paul is a kind of a title, the little one, and he mentions various Gnostic terminology that gives that some kind of theological cachet. So he thinks the guy was originally Simon Magus, or Simon the Sorcerer, or possibly one of these guys mentioned Ben Stada, uh,
Ah,
who's
that in the
supposed to be.
Talmud, Ben Stada.
Uh,
Ah,
and I'm not the first to suggest that, but it's
yeah.
possible that.
I can't remember their names, but there's an author out there, probably a couple of them, that think that Ben Stada was the Egyptian in Josephus, but I don't
Yeah,
remember
yeah,
the
that is a
names.
kind of a musical chairs thing.
Hmm.
But yeah, we also, that could still be part of the same package, because Simon Magus, according to the Clementines, was off in Egypt learning magic while John the Baptist died, and was replaced by the runner-up, Dositheus. And when Simon got back, he said, "Hey, what happened here?" And then they had a miracle contest, and Simon turned out to be the true standing one and became
Hmm.
the successor.
Does that in any way, in your opinion, resemble the rivalry between the different leaders in First Corinthians chapter 1? Uh, do you?
Yeah, I deal with that in this new book, The Gospels Behind the Gospels. I start out with the thing in Mark, the Caesarea Philippi thing. Who do men say that I am? Well, some say John the Baptist raised from the dead, or Elijah, or a prophet like one of the old ones. And then in John, implicitly, the prophet like Moses. And I say this must be, or at least I think this is a commentary by the evangelist trying to refute Christologies current in his own day. And there were people that, oh, I'm for Jesus, and he was the returned Elijah, or oh yeah, I'm with Jesus, though he was the prophet like Moses, and so on down the line. And so I say, let's isolate the stuff that survived into the New Testament that looks like it would have been written by somebody that thought Jesus was Elijah, or that he's the prophet like Moses, or that he was John the Baptist, because there's plenty to pick from with all these categories. And then in the last chapter, I say, we've got something very similar in First Corinthians. What is this, my brethren? I hear the divisions among you. One says, I am of Paul, I am of Apollos, of Cephas, of Christ. And I say, now, that sounds like Christ is on the same shelf with the other packages, that they're rivals to Christ. And I said, boy, that would fit the traditions in the apocryphal Acts of the Apostles, where the apostle is virtually a second Christ, and even as a passion and maybe even a resurrection, etc. And I thought, well, yeah, these traditions survive from those who did esteem Paul as the Savior. And you can even find stuff in the epistles that seem to imply that. Don't worry about me. What I'm undergoing is just is for the sake of the church, to fill up what was lacking in the sufferings of Christ. What's that? Say that again. It sounds like there's some kind of rumbling going on. Was he, or look at the Apocalypse of Paul from Nag Hammadi. Who is it that rises into the heavens and fights off the minions of the demiurge? The name Jesus is never mentioned. It's Paul who is the savior with the gnosis. Well, anyway, I say, is there any possible evidence for a Cephas cult? And I go into all of this, like the Acts of Peter and so on. That this was Cephas as opposed to Simon Magus, who was Paul. Then Apollo. So, boy, do I have fun with this one. I think this guy may have been Apollonius of Tyana. That in fact, in the Western text of Acts, they simply call him Apollonius. And I try to make a case for that. I said, of course, this is speculative, but it's prompted by these strange New Testament passages that people figure, well, they can't mean what they seem to mean. Well, suppose they do. Can we fill in the backstory? And I try to do that in this book.
I remember I actually thought about that before too. I wondered if that
Hmm.
was him. I
Hmm.
think it was in a video I did with James Valiant and Daniel Underbrink way back in the day.
Oh. Well, Apollonius was said to have stopped briefly in Corinth in the life of Apollonius of Tyana by Philostratus.
Yeah. Now that you bring it up, I do feel I think that's probably correct. It's probably him.
Hmm.
I that's my in my opinion. I think you're probably right.
So
I
where
I
does
I didn't delve into it further, but yeah, it's tempting. It's very tempting to believe.
Well, a major stumbling block would seem to be that Luke gives information pointing in a different direction, that he was an eloquent student of scripture from Alexandria. Well, I don't know about anybody else, but it sounds like he's making Apollonius into Philo, that's who he's describing. After all, Eusebius said Philo was a Christian, and that the Therapeutae were Christians, and that Peter met Philo, a Christian. And I have this hunch that the Lucan uh, Apollos is Philo. And that's, I mean, he's making Apollonius over into Philo. He's a safer character.
Is that kind of like a way of him backdating Apollos to Philo's time by making him the same guy?
Well, yeah, though Apollonius would have been roughly contemporary with Jesus with usual dating and with Philo. There wouldn't have been that much difference.
Very interesting. There's some questions that I need to that people have been asking in the chat here. I'm gonna look them over here. He let me see if I can. Oh, I'm really behind on these questions. um, Christopher Malloy asks, "Who are the gospel figures related to the Adiabene monarchy?" Actually, Chris, that's going to be a very complex answer that I think I'll answer that in the next show. Because Dr. Price, I do want to come back and do a show together later at some point. When we get into a series, I think I'm gonna do it pre-recorded and heavily edit it, like tons of references.
Hmm.
So, Chris, I'm gonna have to answer that question during that video. It should answer it for you. But he asks another question. Um, he says, Dr. Price, I've heard Jesus was a common name in the first century, but how do we actually know that? What are those sources?
Josephus, he mentions a bunch of guys named Jesus who couldn't be reduced to a single character. And Jesus, Yeshua, Joshua was a major Old Testament hero. So there's no surprise. It would be surprising if there weren't a lot of guys named Jesus, like Muhammad and Hassan and Hussein today in Islamic countries.
Let me see what else I got here. Yeah, there's the author I was referring to earlier who thinks that that the Adiabene leaders of Jewish revolts, but specifically Ralph Ellis. He's the one that argues that most, if not all, of the Jesuses and Josephus are practically the same person, and I don't think that's correct.
Hmm.
I think that's asking us to leave a lot.
Hmm.
Uh, uh, there's a bunch of questions here. I'm trying to find them. Uh, Actually, I think that's it. I think the chat's filled up so much the other questions are gone. Oh, here we go. Um, this is a response to somebody else in the chat, but I feel like it's an interesting question that can be brought up here as well. Nunbell ever says, wasn't it baby boy sacrifice called a Moloch and practice in the desert?
The only thing I've read germane to that is that scholars for a while were saying that there was no infant sacrifice god named Moloch or Molech, because it just instead referred to such a sacrifice, because there were these little ovens used to cook babies in Carthage that have been discovered that were called Molochs or the equivalent. But there's been, I think the guy's name is something Day, I can't think of it. He did a monograph on Moloch or Molech, where he says no, and he shows there was evidence for there having been this baby devouring God who ruled a flaming netherworld at the foot of Mount Zion. If you went to the top to the temple, you were going into heaven. If you went down below, that's where the fire god Moloch lived. It wasn't a hell. The wicked didn't go there or anything. It was just that the sacrifices this being demanded were human infants.
Hernan Posada says Candace is a title, not a name. Only the Ethiopian Bible puts a name. What do you think about that?
Oh, yeah, that's right. It was a title meaning more or less queen, but Acts seems to think it's the name of a particular queen.
Right.
And apparently at the time it was not.
That's what I think too. I don't think that. I think he see. The way that comment's written seems like he thinks it contradicts the Helen identification, but it doesn't.
Oh, well, yeah. It's just that if this is the, he's changed the names, like the Ethiopian eunuch would have been inspired by Prince Isaetes. So it's not like it's actually any more about these people from Adiabene and Edessa, but that's where he got the story, probably.
Rastaman says, does Dr. Price think it possible that Hebrews could have been written by Paul, Jacob? That might as well be a question for you. Because the way he was phrasing it was asking me, like, why ask me? You're here.
Yeah, I don't think it's likely at all, because you'd have to explain the differences in vocabulary and conceptuality. It's not like there's anything in there that Paulinist Christians would object to, but it doesn't seem like it's by the same person. It's like First and Second Peter. Neither one of them's by Peter, but you can tell they're not even by the same author as one another. Sentence structure and things like that. And so I think it's highly unlikely. But then again, I think all the epistles attributed to Paul are probably later pseudepigraphs by different authors.
Yeah, I agree with you on Hebrews. It doesn't even claim Paul wrote it to begin
Right.
with, making it just doubly improbable that Paul wrote it.
Mhm.
and it talks about a high priestly Jesus, similar to Pope Clement's letter to the Corinthians, which isn't talked about in the other Pauline epistles at all. That's one huge difference there.
Well, J.C. O'Neill even argued that this sounds so much like Qumran that he thinks it was originally about the teacher of righteousness and his death at the hands of the wicked priest. And he backs this up by saying that every stinking instance of the names Jesus or Christ seems insecure textually. You can find some manuscript or other where the name is absent or different, implying that we don't have the original reading here. And he says, he thinks it was said, that he thought this was a Christianizing of a Qumran text, originally about the teacher of righteousness.
Jojo Freelancer Cup asks you a question that actually is something that occurred to me before. He says, Dr. Robert and Price, so Jesus is historical because he has competing factions?
Well, I'm not, I think I see where you inferred that when I say that Jesus had rivals, cult figureheads or sect figureheads, that doesn't necessarily mean there was a Jesus. it would certainly fit if there were, but all you would need to posit, like I'm not convinced there was a historical Apollonius of Tyana. I did a long article about that in the Journal of Higher Criticism, but it doesn't really matter. Eventually, you definitely have like Mithras or Apollo. There was never any Mithras or Apollo as far as we know, but they certainly became worshipped entities, at least of the religious imagination. This would fit even if there had not been a historical Jesus. Of course, again, I remind people, I don't take mythicism as a dogma. It cannot be proven. It just strikes me as the most plausible way of reading the evidence. But I wasn't there. How do I know?
So that's what I thought. So you're more like in the middle, like agnostic. You're really uncertain if there was or wasn't one. Is that the
Yeah,
correct
I have to
interpretation?
admit the Jesus, the zealot hypothesis of Robert Eisler
SGF
and
Brandon.
SGF Brandon, that's and even with the adjunct of the Valiant and Fahey thing, the creating Christ, they make a very plausible case for the aftermath of a historical revolutionary Jesus. So I don't rule that out, but there's so much about the general gospel tradition that makes me think it probably has simply absorbed similarities to some of these messianic figures along the way. But their hypothesis is quite plausible. So I don't bet on either one.
Yeah, but in spite of that, James was originally in the uncertain thing, but I am, as I think I am a historicist. I think there was a Jesus, but in a similar view to the one you just spouted, I think that he's been heavily mythologized in that stream. He's been totally replaced by the biblical Jesus, and everybody pretty much says the biblical Jesus, as described in the Bible, didn't exist. He didn't do all those miracles or any of that stuff. I mean, everybody from both sides says that. So, but yeah, my interpretation of First Corinthians, as I've told Valiant before, I think the rival factions in there suggests that there were followers of Christ distinct from all the rest, that were earlier than the rest, that seem to be following this guy that they think was the Messiah. That's my take on it, and my primary issue, I think this involves with Josephus. I am convinced Josephus did mention a Jesus. Died in the 30s, primarily because of Origen telling us that he read Josephus and that James is the brother of Jesus who was called to Christ. He even cites the book that Josephus mentioned him in. And he's like, I think he did. But yeah, he does cite that. He does say that Josephus, in one of his 20 books, that he does mention this. I think that is the case. But other than that, I do recognize he's been heavily, heavily tampered with and mythologized. Starting with the Paul's letters, whether he wrote them or not. Then the Gospels coming just after that. And the gospel Jesus is more like is totally breaking from the historical Jesus completely. He's turned into this he turns into this mess, this theological harmony, is composite Jesus basically, where a bunch of Old Testament guys get slapped in there. Maybe even Titus himself is slapped in there. And Dead Sea Scrolls, Hellenism, Roman mythology, all just squeezed together tightly into the Gospels, and they contradict each other. There's even contradicting ideologies that are being attributed to Jesus. Like sometimes when it's convenient, Jesus is pro-Roman, or he's anti-Roman, or sometimes he'll condone slavery or condemn it. Just it's a mess, and until people try to straighten it out, I'm like, I don't think you can straighten it out. It's too much of a mess. Jesus can't make up his mind. Does he turn the tables to tax collectors, or do you pay your taxes to Caesar? I don't know. That's one of the many examples.
Yeah, you've got people on different sides of various issues claiming the authority of Jesus for it, which still happens today.
Yeah. Christopher Malloy says, "Is Christopher Lawson's Jesus of the Dead Sea Scrolls theory the Jesus? He makes a compelling case." I remember that in a previous interview we did together. I even clipped it, made it a separate video even from it. You were talking about. I asked you, what did you think about the theory that Dead Sea Scrolls take to the first century and Jesus probably is in there? I asked a similar question. I asked a question like that, or that Paul was in there, which are related questions anyway. And why don't you just go ahead and answer the question? Like, what do you think about that, Lawson's theory? That Jesus is in the scrolls?
Well, I don't find that implausible, since the whole darn thing is in cipher language, basically. Again, you can only speculate, but I think that Barbara Thiering, who I believe is echoing G.R. Driver, somebody from an earlier generation, who said that he thought the teacher of righteousness was John the Baptist. And that's entirely plausible to me, in the same place, the same recipe with the locusts and all this, the baptizing, et cetera, et cetera. And then some say the teacher of righteousness was Jesus, but Thiering says that Jesus is the wicked priest, so-called, as the followers of John saw him. Yeah, that's not much different than what mainstream critical scholars say, that Jesus and John the Baptist seem to have split at one point because of the thing with, John the Baptist comes neither eating nor drinking. You say he's a demoniac. The Son of Man came both eating and drinking. And you say, look at this glutton and this drunkard. Well, that implies they at least, why don't your disciples fast like they do? They must have had some kind of a separation. And that's kind of what it looks like in the Dead Sea Scrolls between the teacher of righteousness and the wicked priest. But then James the Just says that, Robert Eisman says James the Just was the teacher of righteousness, and that Ananus was the wicked priest. And I don't know if he really has a place for Jesus in that scenario. But then there's somebody, I can't think of his name now, who says that he thinks that there were several teachers of righteousness, that it was an ongoing office, which certainly is not implausible, and that John the Baptist was, and then James the Just was, and maybe there were others before and since. It's really tough to say, because all these things kind of ring true.
His name is Richard A. Freund.
What, Richard what?
A. Freund. Richard A. Freund. Yeah, he says, the difference of opinion over the positioning of the teacher of righteousness leads me to conclude that perhaps all of these researchers are correct. A teacher of righteousness did lead the group in the 2nd century BCE when it was established. Another teacher of righteousness led the sect in the 1st century BCE, and finally another teacher emerged in the 1st century CE from the book called Digging Through the Bible, Modern Archaeology and the Ancient Bible, Roman and Littlefield, 2009.
Yeah, that could well be. I mean, these guys have successors. It could be that the original was the only one, and that they just kept alive his exegetical tradition.
Yeah.
But given the idea that their beliefs are based on a charismatic interpretation, they might have felt the need for further inspired interpreters, like the Shiite imams. Okay, there weren't any more prophets. Muhammad was the seal of the prophets, but Allah's not going to leave us without guidance. So he's given us these imams from the line of Ali. And it could easily have been that way. It's not like we know different. We have fragments to deal with. Well, there must have been more than we know, whatever it was. So those are pretty good guesses.
If it is true the scrolls do date to the 1st century CE, in my opinion, depending on if that scenario is true or not, I find Professor Eisman's theory the more probable one than the other identifications, because the wicked priest and the teacher seem to have hated each other. And the wicked priest was going after him, wanted to kill the teacher. That's what the scrolls talk about. And I don't see that going on between Jesus and John. I know Barbara Fearing is she thinks there's a lot of parallels with the teacher in John. I just don't think there are enough to say her theory works better than Eisenman's. Now, with Jesus, that's interesting because in Acts of the Apostles, Paul being called a liar in Galatians and whatever, he could be. I think it was called. I think he said I'm not a liar again in First or Second Corinthians. I can't remember which letter, but he does. And if we take that and the high priest Joseph Caiaphas and the other high priest Ananias Senior being the opponents of Jesus, and Paul in Acts receiving a vision from Jesus saying, Paul, why are you persecuting me? Maybe in that scenario you got a liar and you got a high priest there to bring up which high priest you pick as being the wicked and the liar versus Jesus in the scrolls. That's an interesting scenario. Lawson tends to look at it like the 40-year cycle and the scrolls is suggestive that the teacher died 40 years before the temple was destroyed on 70 CE, so that means the teacher died on 30 CE, which is similar to the timing that Jesus is supposed to have died. But my issue with his theory, ultimately my issue is the same issue I have with Eisenman's theory, is that, okay, my common issue with both of their theories and with Barbara Fearing in the long run is, if that's true, why does the Damascus document, and the Damascus document is pretty clear about this, places the teacher in the 170s BCE. It says, he came and founded this community, a righteous teacher coming out of the wilderness. 390 years after the temple of Solomon was destroyed, basically 586 BCE, plus 20 years in the wilderness, which would land you right on 176 BCE, give or take. So, unless the Damascus document is talking about somebody else, which it doesn't seem to be talking about somebody else, that kind of gets me stuck. Like that the earlier dating, which most scholars seem to go with, works out better based on what the Damascus document says. Based on that.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see if there's some more questions. Jojo Freelancer Cup says, why do you believe in a historical Jesus? You named a historical intertextuality between the Bible and Josephus, right? And that's a question for me, obviously. Well, yeah, I take a controversial position that basically, like Dr. Price, I actually think the New Testament dates really late. I don't put it as late as he does, yet I could be persuaded. I'm open-minded. But I am convinced by his argument that Paul's epistles seem to be aware of the Jewish war, that they happened, the temple's gone. And that, to me, it explains the wrath of God upon the Jews in 1 Thessalonians. It explains to me why Jesus is the temple. It kind of gets metaphysical. And everybody's the temple too sometimes in Paul's letters. I'm like, well, it's kind of sounds like an argument saying we don't need a third temple. Everybody's the temple. And I do think the New Testament in general has an awareness of Josephus, especially the Gospels.
Yeah.
Hugh Schoenfield in the Passover plot he made an argument that Joseph of Arimathea, he's the earliest author that I'm aware of, there may be somebody earlier, correct me if I'm wrong, that Joseph of Arimathea was Josephus Flavius. He suggested something like that Josephus of Arimathea is at least a story, the way they wrote about the character was based on Joseph of Arimathea to an extent. But he seems to think that there were two different people, but his story was written to purposely parallel Josephus as a rewrite. Kind of like the Stephen character in Acts is a rewrite of. He's like a Hollywood actor switching out for James in the movie. But yeah, go ahead.
Did you ever see the movie based on the Passover plot?
I don't think I have. I've heard of it. I need to see it.
This is reaching back now and showing my age, but you ever watch the sitcom Cheers about the bar in Boston?
I don't think I did. I don't think I've seen that either.
Well, it's just funny that the guy that plays James the Just in the Passover plot played this sleazy the disgusting character in Cheers, and I couldn't help laughing once I saw him in the Passover plot movie. But Schoenfield was really interesting. He was very erudite, and he was one of the last of the old time rationalists. He believed that Jesus did exist, and even that most of the stuff in the Gospels happened, but it was all natural and everything was arranged by Jesus. That when he fulfilled prophecies, it was because he had studied the text and he figured, well, God has called me to be the Messiah. I see what I'm to do here, so I will attempt to do all these things. Which, of course, people say, oh, he's got Jesus as some kind of crazy schemer. No, he doesn't. He's just saying, here's this guy that saw the outlines of the mission for which God had sent him and tried to arrange it. And the stuff he says about the mistaken identity theory of the resurrection appearances, if you believe that they're as accurate as he does, it makes a lot of sense. And of course, I think he's given them way too much credit. I think the stories are fictional, period. But if they weren't, you'd put an interesting light on the fact that nobody seems to recognize him at first. Lord, if you're the caretaker and you know where they laid Jesus' body, let me know. And he says, Mary, hello. And, oh my God, Jesus. Look, the two guys on the way to Emmaus. They're walking for hours with this guy. Suddenly at dinner, they're, oh, holy mackerel, it's Jesus. Yeah. And again and again, like Schoenfield said, that nobody was pulling a trick. But these must have been secret associates of Jesus, like the guys who arranged the Passover Seder for him in the upper room, and like the guy with carrying the water jar. Obviously, Jesus knew these people and made arrangements with them. And so the old Renan and all the old rationalists said this kind of thing. Well, Schoenfield showed that if you had reason to believe there was a historical core, the rationalist view would make some pretty good sense. And still, I don't buy that, but it's an interesting performance. And he does say a number of things, point out like the nature of sectarian Judaism in northern Palestine that nobody else really talks about. I really like his work a lot. And his translation of the New Testament, the authentic New Testament, I love that. So he was one heck of a character, almost like a second Albert Schweitzer.
Yeah, his work was pretty amazing. Yeah, I actually did a live show with Edward Dodge, author of the book Goddess.
Yeah, me too.
You did do a show, Ed?
Yeah.
Which channel was it on?
Boy. I don't know. It was his thing, not mine. He was the host. I'm not sure. He posted it, but I
guess it was on his channel then.
Yeah, it must be. Yeah.
Yeah. He thinks that, as you know, I'm sure, Jesus survived the crucifixion, and he died 40 days later. I actually suggested to him in the live stream that I had this idea that I also told James Valiant about, like Irenaeus. What he says sounds like another Schwarzenegger thing, because he says that Pilate crucified Jesus during the reign of Claudius. I'm like, well, that sure sounds like Suetonius talking about Crestus instigating a revolt at Rome around 4950 AD. I'm like, did Irenaeus read Suetonius and think, oh man, that's Jesus, that's not good. He's alive in the 40s. I better say Pilate was still reigning in the 40s too. So he lengthens the reign of Pilate in order to move the crucifixion of Jesus about 10 years forward in time, give or take, 10 years plus. But my interpretation of that is, and I don't believe this currently, but what I find a possible interpretation is that could Suetonius, if that's Jesus, if he's talking about Jesus, Is that him after he survived the cross?
That's what Barbara Thiering thought also. And she said the story of Quo Vadis, where Peter's convinced to skip Rome, like Aristotle said when he left and didn't want to die like Socrates. He said, I'm leaving lest Athens sin twice against philosophy. Well, Peter's persuaded to leave, and he meets Jesus on the road into Rome and says, what are you doing here, Lord? And he says, well, somebody's got to be crucified. I guess it's going to have to be me again. And Peter said, okay, I get it. And,
Yeah, I remember that story. And
well, Barbara Thiering says, yeah, that's what happened. Jesus was still alive.
Does she? Oh, I didn't mean to interrupt.
I mean, it sounds wacky, but I don't care. I love these speculations, these possibilities.
Right.
It's not stupid. I mean, in fact, she has this incredible grasp of ancient calendar lore with the Gnostics and the Essenes, and bases some of her theories on that. I don't know enough to challenge that. I'll never understand that stuff, and neither will her critics. So I don't dismiss her.
So since you say that she puts that she does think that too, based on what I was saying earlier, do you mean that she thinks that Suetonius, this crest is Jesus? Does she think that?
I think so.
Huh. Yeah, I haven't really, like, I'm familiar with some of her work, but I haven't looked into enough. I didn't even know that she thought that. That's interesting.
Mm.
I definitely got to look into her work more.
Yeah, she is fascinating.
She sounds very fascinating. Let's see if there's some questions if I missed here. Let me just take a look for a second. Oh, Jojo, I didn't quite answer all of your question. I didn't answer why I think there was a historical Jesus. Well, since I'm currently convinced that Josephus did mention a guy called Jesus that was crucified at the hands of Pilate, but I'm definitely convinced that a Christian scribe manipulated it to make him look more like the gospel Jesus. I think I tend to view that Jesus more like the original anchor, like the foundation that the New Testament built a composite Jesus over. Because it's like the New Testament Jesus isn't perfectly the same person as that Jesus. That the Jesus in Josephus, if he did mention him, which I think he did, he would just be another one of those many rebels in Josephus that died, and that's just about it. I just think they created this composite character as a way of harmonizing and unifying different sectors, different religious sects, during the early days of Christianity. And I think that Paul, because I do find Dr. Price's arguments very compelling on the possible multiple layers of interpolations in letters, heavy manipulation of letters in the 2nd century, the rewriting and remaking them. So yeah, there was definitely different authors of varying opinions trying to change the Jesus story. They had many different points of view. What did Jesus do? They didn't really agree with each other. You got 2 genealogies, for crying out loud, which spells it out clearly. I think they used that specific character as the original basis to create the biblical character, because there are good arguments that the Mark's Jesus is basically Jesus ben Ananus with a bunch of mythology hanged over him, and he seems to me, the Mark's gospel is combining elements of Jesus ben Ananus, the Jesus in the 30s, into the same person, kind of like how the Doctrine of Adi is doing exactly the same thing in the 4th century AD. That part was done by Eusebius. And the funny thing is, Ralph actually argues, because of the forgery that is the Doctrine of Adi, that Jesus lived in the 80s, 60s. And I don't buy that. If the guy existed, I'm pretty convinced he must have died in the 30s. I know there are some people out there that argue he could have lived in a different time, but to me, that's a lot to swallow. That's hard for me to believe that Jesus could have lived in a different time, in my personal opinion.
Well, I kind of got to be
Yeah.
heading out of here.
Yeah, I understand. We've been live for a while.
Very, very interesting and a lot of fun.
Yep. So I thank everybody for joining me. Thank you for joining me again, Dr. Price. So
Anytime.
now I'm going to play the outro, and I'll see all you guys later. Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.